Snow crashed against the trees like a wall falling apart, and Elena Whitfield heard the gunshot before she saw anything at all. She froze at the edge of the tree line, her lantern swinging in her cold hand, her breath catching in her throat. Another shot cracked through the storm, closer this time, and somewhere beneath the howling wind, she heard a man groan in pain. She should have turned back. Every instinct told her to run home, bolt the door, and pretend she had heard nothing. But her feet carried her forward instead, deeper into the white chaos, toward the sound of suffering. She found him face down in a snowbank near the frozen creek, his coat soaked through with blood that had already begun to darken and freeze at the edges. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead, and his lips had turned a pale shade of blue. Elena knelt beside him, her heart hammering, and rolled him onto his back. He was young, maybe 30, with a strong jaw shadowed by days of stubble and a wound in his side that looked far too serious for a woman alone in the mountains to handle. A folded paper had slipped halfway out of his coat pocket. She did not need to unfold it to guess what it was. The word "wanted" was already visible in bold letters at the top. For a moment, she considered leaving him there. The storm would finish what the bullet had started, and no one would ever know she had found him. But his eyes fluttered open just then, gold flecks catching the lantern light in a way that made her breath stop, and he whispered a single word that undid every sensible thought in her head. Please. She did not remember deciding to help him. She only remembered looping his arm over her shoulder and dragging him through the snow toward her cabin, her muscles screaming with the effort, the storm swallowing their tracks behind them as if erasing all evidence that this night had ever happened. Getting him through the door took nearly everything she had. She laid him on the rug in front of the fireplace and worked quickly, cutting away the ruined fabric of his shirt to look at the wound beneath. It was ugly, a deep tear along his ribs, but it had already stopped bleeding as heavily as she expected. She packed it with clean cloth anyway, her hands shaking, and pulled a wool blanket over him before adding another log to the fire. He did not wake again that night. Elena sat in the chair across from him, unable to sleep, watching the rise and fall of his chest, and wondering what kind of trouble she had just carried through her own front door. Outside, the wind screamed against the shutters, and twice she thought she heard something moving in the trees beyond the cabin, something with a low, rolling growl that did not belong to any dog she knew. She told herself it was only the storm playing tricks on her ears. By morning, the blizzard had not eased even slightly. Snow had piled halfway up the windows, and the world outside had become a solid sheet of white, with no roads, no paths, and no way for anyone to reach the cabin or leave it. Elena realized with a slow, sinking feeling that she was now trapped inside her own home with a wounded stranger who was very likely a criminal. She busied herself with chores to keep her mind occupied. She fed the fire, checked on her small stock of supplies, and glanced at the stranger every few minutes, as if he might vanish or turn into something else entirely if she looked away too long. Around midday, he finally stirred, his eyes opening halfway before closing again with a pained breath. "Where am I?" he asked, his voice rough and dry. "You are safe," Elena said, though she was not entirely certain that was true. "You were shot. I found you near the creek." He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it, a sharp hiss escaping through his teeth as he pressed a hand to his side. Elena moved to help him settle back down, and for a brief moment their eyes met. His gaze held something wild in it, something guarded and watchful, like an animal deciding whether to trust the hand that fed it or bolt for the nearest exit. "My name is Colt," he said finally, as if offering that small piece of himself was the only currency he had to repay her kindness. "Elena," she replied, and something in the way he said her name back, quiet and careful, made her chest tighten in a way she did not fully understand. Over the following hours, she learned little else about him. He was tired, in pain, and clearly unwilling to explain the wanted poster tucked into his coat, though he must have known she had seen it. Elena decided not to push. Whatever trouble followed him, it had not followed him through her door yet, and the storm outside made the question of what to do with him entirely irrelevant for the moment. There was nowhere for either of them to go. That evening, she made a thin broth from the last of her dried vegetables and helped him eat a few spoonfuls before he drifted back to sleep, exhausted from the effort of simply staying conscious. Elena sat by the fire long after the cabin fell silent, staring at the flickering flames and turning over the strange details of the night in her mind. The wound that had already begun to close faster than any wound she had ever tended. The gold flash in his eyes that could not have been the lantern light alone. The low growl she had heard in the trees, a sound too large and too deliberate to belong to any wolf that hunted this part of the mountains. She pushed the thoughts aside, telling herself that exhaustion and fear were making her imagine things that were not there. A wounded man was simply a wounded man, nothing more. And come morning, when the storm finally broke, she would decide what to do about the stranger sleeping in front of her fire. But morning came, and the storm did not break. If anything, it grew worse, the wind screaming louder through the night, burying the cabin deeper under snow that showed no sign of stopping. Elena stood at the window, watching the white world outside swallow every trace of the path she had once known so well, and understood, with a strange mixture of dread and something she refused to name, that she and the stranger called Colt were going to be alone together for quite some time. 3 days passed before the storm loosened its grip enough for Elena to see past her own porch steps. In that time, Colt's fever had broken, his strength slowly returning in ways that still struck her as unnatural. The wound at his side, which should have taken weeks to heal properly, had closed into a thin pink scar by the 4th morning. She said nothing about it, though she watched him more closely than she let on, cataloging every small oddity the way a person collects pieces of a puzzle they are afraid to finish. He was quiet by nature, careful with his words, as though every sentence had to be measured before it left his mouth. But as the days wore on, small things slipped through the cracks of his guarded silence. He knew how to set a proper fire without wasting wood. He noticed the way she favored her left knee when the weather turned cold, though she had never mentioned the old injury. He seemed to hear things before she did, turning his head toward sounds she could not detect at all, his body going still and alert, like a creature listening for danger long before it arrived. Elena told herself these were simply the habits of a man who had spent his life on the run, sharpened senses born from necessity rather than anything stranger. It was easier to believe that than to consider the alternative, whatever the alternative might be. They fell into an uneasy rhythm together. She cooked, he chopped wood once his strength allowed it, moving stiffly at first and then with surprising ease that made her wonder how a man so recently near death could recover so quickly. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, and slowly, cautiously, conversation began to bridge the space between them. He told her small, true things, careful and controlled. That he came from a family who had once had land and lost it. That he had spent the last several years moving from place to place, never settling long enough to call anywhere home. He never explained the wanted poster, and she never asked, though the question sat between them like a shadow neither wanted to acknowledge directly. In turn, Elena spoke of her husband, gone 2 winters now, taken by a fever the doctors in town could not name. She spoke of the loneliness that had settled into the cabin since his passing, a quiet she had grown used to but never quite comfortable with. Colt listened in a way few people ever had. His full attention resting on her, as though her words carried weight he refused to let slip past him unnoticed. There was a night, the 5th since the storm began, when Elena woke to a strange sound outside the cabin. Not the wind this time, but something else. A low chorus of howls carried on the frozen air, closer than any wolf pack had ever dared come to her home. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding, and found Colt already standing at the window, his body rigid, his hands braced against the frame as though holding himself in place by force. "They will not come closer tonight," he said quietly, without turning around. "The storm still favors us." "How do you know that?" Elena asked, pulling her blanket tighter around her shoulders. He did not answer right away. When he finally turned to face her, His expression was unreadable in the dim firelight, caught somewhere between exhaustion and something that looked almost like grief. "I have learned to read weather better than most men," he said instead, and though the answer felt incomplete, she let it stand unchallenged. She was beginning to understand that Colt's silences said more than his words ever could, and that pressing too hard might close a door she was not yet ready to lose. The following morning, as she prepared breakfast, Elena noticed something that made her pause entirely. A set of tracks near the tree line, half buried by fresh snow but still visible enough to make her blood run cold. They were far too large to belong to any wolf native to these mountains, spaced in a stride that suggested something enormous had circled her home sometime in the night without ever approaching the door. She said nothing to Colt about the tracks, though she suspected, from the tension in his shoulders when he glanced toward the same tree line later that day, that he had already seen them himself and understood exactly what they meant. Despite the strangeness gathering quietly around them, something else was growing between Elena and Colt as well, something neither of them spoke aloud, but both could feel taking shape in the small moments that filled their days. The way he always made certain she ate before he did. The way she had begun leaving the chair closest to the fire open for him without thinking about it. The careful warmth that crept into his voice whenever he said her name, as though it were something precious he was still learning how to hold. On the seventh night, as the fire burned low and the storm outside finally began to soften into gentle snowfall, Colt spoke without being asked. "I should not have let you bring me here," he said, his eyes fixed on the flames rather than on her. "I have put you in danger simply by existing in your home." Elena studied him carefully, the firelight carving shadows along the sharp lines of his face. "What kind of danger?" she asked, her voice steady despite the unease curling in her stomach. "The kind that does not care about storms or mountains or the innocence of the people who show kindness to strangers," he said. "The kind that will keep looking until it finds me, no matter how far I run or how well I hide." "Then why are you telling me this now?" "Because you deserve to know what you have taken into your home," he said, finally meeting her eyes, "even if you are not ready to hear the whole truth of it." She wanted to press him further, to demand the full truth right then and there, but something in his expression stopped her. Not secrecy exactly, but a kind of fear she had not expected to see in a man who had survived a gunshot wound and 3 days buried under snow without complaint. Whatever he was protecting her from, it frightened even him. Elena reached across the small space between their chairs and rested her hand over his, a gesture more instinctive than decided. "Whatever it is," she said quietly, "I am not asking you to leave." Colt looked down at her hand covering his, and for the first time since she had found him bleeding in the snow, something in his rigid shoulders eased, just slightly, just enough for her to notice. Outside, the storm continued its slow retreat into silence, but Elena understood, with a certainty that settled deep into her bones, that whatever calm had returned to the mountain that night, it would not last. Something was still circling beyond the tree line, patient and watchful, waiting for the snow to clear enough to finish what the gunshots in the storm had started. The days that followed brought a fragile kind of peace to the cabin, though Elena could no longer pretend the strangeness around Colt was simply her imagination working overtime. The wound on his side had vanished almost entirely, leaving only a faint silver line where a scar of that size should have taken months to fade. She caught him once standing perfectly still in the yard at dawn, his head tilted as though listening to something far beyond the range of any ordinary hearing, his eyes distant and alert in a way that made her stomach twist with an unease she could not name. She began to notice smaller things too. The way food seemed to disappear from the pantry faster than 2 people could reasonably eat it, though Colt never appeared to overindulge at the table. The way his hands, when they brushed against hers passing a bowl or a cup, always ran warmer than any human hand had a right to be. The way, once, in a half-asleep moment by the fire, she thought she saw his eyes catch the firelight and hold it there far longer than eyes were meant to, glowing faintly gold before fading back to their ordinary brown. She told herself each time that exhaustion and isolation were simply playing games with her mind, that a woman alone through a long winter storm was bound to imagine things in the shadows. But the explanations grew thinner with each passing day, stretched too far to hold the weight of what she was beginning, quietly and reluctantly, to suspect. Despite the growing unease, or perhaps because of it, Elena found herself drawn to Colt in ways she had not expected. There was a gentleness beneath his guarded exterior, a carefulness in the way he moved through her home, as though determined not to disturb the fragile peace she had built there alone. He fixed a loose hinge on the pantry door without being asked. He noticed when her firewood supply ran low and quietly restocked it before she had to mention the problem herself. Small kindnesses, offered without expectation of anything in return, the kind that spoke louder than any declaration ever could. One evening, as she stitched a tear in an old quilt by lamplight, Colt sat across from her, watching the careful movement of her needle with an intensity that made her glance up more than once. "You are staring," she said, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth despite herself. "I am trying to understand how you learned to be so steady," he said. "Most people, faced with what you found in the snow, would have run the other direction. Most people did not lose a husband to a fever that took him slowly enough to teach them that running rarely solves anything," Elena replied. "Sometimes staying and facing whatever comes is the only choice that makes any sense." Colt was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the low light. Then, softly, he said, "I am not entirely certain that what follows me can be faced the way ordinary trouble can be faced." Elena set her sewing aside, giving him her full attention. "Then help me understand what I am facing," she said. "I have given you shelter without asking for a single explanation. I think I have earned the right to know, even if the truth frightens me." For the first time since she had found him in the snow, Colt looked as though he might finally answer honestly. His jaw tightened, his hands curling into loose fists against his knees, and Elena held her breath, sensing that whatever came next would change everything between them, whether for better or for worse. But before he could speak, a sound broke the stillness of the cabin, a low, deliberate knock against the front door that neither of them had expected, on a night still thick with snow and isolation. Colt was on his feet instantly, his body coiled with a tension that looked far too practiced for an ordinary man. His eyes fixed on the door with an intensity that made the hair on the back of Elena's neck rise. "Someone is here," he said quietly, and the fear in his voice was unlike anything she had heard from him before. Elena's heart pounded as she moved toward the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to glimpse a shape standing on her porch through the falling snow, tall and still, watching the cabin with a patience that felt far too deliberate for an ordinary traveler caught in a storm. Whoever, or whatever, had come to her door, Elena understood in that frozen, breathless moment that the quiet winter she had built for herself was about to end, and that the answers Colt had been so carefully guarding were no longer a choice, but a necessity neither of them could avoid any longer. The knock came again, harder this time, 3 sharp raps that echoed through the small cabin like a warning. Colt moved toward the window, staying low, careful not to let the shape outside see him through the gap in the curtain. Elena's hands trembled as she reached for the iron poker resting beside the fireplace, gripping it tightly, though she had no real idea what she would do with it if the door came open. A voice called out from the porch, muffled by the wind but clear enough to understand. "My name is Grant Coleman," the voice said. "I am tracking a man who may have passed this way, wounded, dangerous, wanted for murder 2 counties over. If you have seen anyone matching that description, I would ask you to speak now rather than risk harboring a criminal without knowing it." Elena's breath caught in her throat. She glanced at Colt, whose face had gone pale and still, his eyes locked on hers with a silent, desperate plea that needed no words. She did not know the whole truth of what he had done or not done, but she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she was not about to hand him over to a stranger standing on her porch in the middle of a snowstorm. Elena set the poker down, steadied her voice, and walked to the door, opening it only enough to show her face and block the view of the room behind her. "I have seen no one," she said. "I have been alone here through the entire storm. You are welcome to search the yard if you do not believe me, though I doubt you will find any tracks worth following in this snow." Grant studied her for a long moment, his eyes sharp beneath the brim of his hat, snow gathering on his shoulders as he stood there weighing her words. Finally, he nodded once, though the suspicion in his gaze did not fully fade. "If you see him," he said, "you send word to town immediately. He is more dangerous than he looks, and I would hate for a kind woman like yourself to learn that the hard way." Elena forced a small, steady smile. "I will remember that," she said, and closed the door before he could see the way her hands shook against the wood. She listened to his boots crunch away through the snow, waiting until the sound faded entirely before she allowed herself to breathe again. When she turned around, Colt was standing exactly where she had left him, his expression a mixture of gratitude and something far heavier, something that looked almost like guilt. "You lied for me," he said quietly. "I made a choice," Elena corrected him. "There is a difference." He crossed the room slowly, stopping close enough that she could see the storm still swirling behind his eyes, unresolved and unspoken. "You do not know what you have chosen to protect," he said. "If you did, you might not have lied at all." "Then tell me," Elena said, her voice firm despite the fear coiling tightly in her chest. "Tell me everything, right now, before another stranger comes knocking on my door." Colt was silent for a long moment, staring into the fire as though gathering the courage to say words he had never spoken aloud to anyone outside his own kind. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, carrying the weight of a truth long buried. "I am not entirely human, Elena," he said. "I never have been." The words hung in the air between them. Impossible, and yet somehow, given everything she had witnessed over the past week, entirely believable. Elena lowered herself slowly into her chair, her legs suddenly unsteady beneath her. "Explain," she said simply, because it was the only word she could manage. Colt knelt before the fire, his hands clasped loosely between his knees, and began to speak of things Elena had only ever heard in old stories told to frighten children before bed. He spoke of families like his own, born with the ability to take the shape of wolves, living quietly among ordinary people for generations, hidden by necessity rather than shame. He spoke of packs and territories, of leaders called alphas who carried responsibility for the safety of everyone beneath them, and of the blood that ran through his own veins, marking him as one such leader, born to guide and protect his people. "I was alpha of my pack," he said, "until I was accused of a crime I did not commit. My own second in command, a man named Dale Ferris, orchestrated the death of our previous alpha and placed the blame squarely on me, knowing the pack would never question his loyalty as quickly as they questioned mine. I ran because staying meant certain death, not because I was guilty of anything beyond trusting the wrong man." Elena absorbed each word carefully, matching them against everything she had witnessed since finding him in the snow. The wound that healed too quickly, the eyes that flashed gold in low light, the impossible tracks circling her home in the dead of night. Every strange detail suddenly clicked into place with a clarity that left her both terrified and, oddly, relieved to finally understand. "And the howls I heard," she said slowly, "those were not ordinary wolves." "No," Colt admitted. "Those were Dale's scouts, sent to find me before I can return and challenge his claim to leadership. If they find me here, they will not hesitate to harm anyone standing in their way, including you." Elena's mind raced through the implications of everything he had just revealed, but beneath the fear, something steadier and more certain took root as well. She had already chosen to protect him once tonight, lying to a stranger's face without a single moment of hesitation. Knowing the full truth now did not change that choice. If anything, it strengthened it. "Then, we need a plan," she said firmly, surprising even herself with the steadiness in her own voice. because I do not intend to let anyone, human or otherwise, harm either of us while there is still breath in my body to stop them." Colt looked up at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something raw and unguarded, gratitude tangled together with a fierce, protective warmth that made her chest tighten in response. Whatever came next, storm or pack or bounty hunter, Elena understood that she was no longer simply sheltering a wounded stranger. She had chosen a side, and there would be no turning back from it now. Over the next several days, Elena and Colt worked together to prepare for whatever might come. He taught her small things that might matter if danger arrived while he was unable to protect her fully. How to recognize the particular silence that fell over the forest right before a pack drew close. How to bar the windows more securely. Which paths through the mountains led to safety and which led only deeper into danger. In turn, she taught him how to read the specific patterns of this land, the places where the snow drifted deep enough to hide a person entirely, the hollow beneath the old barn where her husband had once stored supplies during hard winters. Their partnership deepened into something neither of them named aloud, though it lived in every careful glance, every shared task completed in comfortable silence, every moment where their hands brushed and neither pulled away as quickly as caution might have suggested. Elena found herself thinking less about the danger Colt represented and more about the quiet, steady comfort of no longer being entirely alone in the world. But comfort, she was beginning to learn, rarely lasted long when danger circled close enough to smell fear on the wind, and somewhere beyond the tree line, patient and merciless, Dale Ferris and his scouts were drawing steadily nearer, waiting only for the right moment to strike. The bounty hunter's visit had rattled something loose in the quiet rhythm of the cabin, a reminder that the outside world had not forgotten Colt simply because the storm had hidden him for a handful of days. Elena found herself glancing toward the windows more often now, watching the tree line with a wariness she had not felt since her husband's illness had first taken hold years before. Colt noticed her unease, and rather than dismissing it, matched it with his own quiet vigilance, positioning himself near the door each evening, as though his body alone could hold back whatever might come. 2 nights after Grant Coleman's visit, the howls returned, closer than before, circling the edges of the property with a patience that made Elena's skin crawl. Colt stood at the window for hours, unmoving, his jaw tight and his eyes distant, tracking movements Elena could not see or hear herself. When she asked him what he sensed, he told her only that Dale's scouts had found the cabin, though they had not yet worked up the courage, or received the order, to approach directly. "They are testing the boundaries," he explained quietly. "Trying to determine if I am here, and if I am strong enough still to defend myself. Word will reach Dale soon regardless of what they decide tonight." Elena wrapped her arms around herself, chilled by more than the cold seeping through the cabin walls. "What happens when he learns you are here?" she asked. Colt's expression hardened into something she had not seen from him before, a coldness that spoke of battles fought long before she had ever found him bleeding in the snow. "Then he sends more than scouts," he said. "He sends enough force to make certain I never leave these mountains alive." The weight of that statement settled heavily over the following days. Elena began keeping a small bag packed near the door, filled with what few supplies she thought they might need if they were forced to flee suddenly. Colt spent long hours outside despite the lingering cold, strengthening the cabin's defenses in ways only someone with his particular set of senses could manage, marking boundaries with methods Elena did not fully understand but trusted regardless. Despite the mounting tension, small moments of warmth continued to bloom between them, stubborn and persistent, even against the backdrop of looming danger. One evening, as Elena prepared a simple stew from her dwindling supplies, Colt surprised her by humming a low, unfamiliar tune while he split kindling near the fire, the sound rough and unpracticed but oddly soothing all the same. "I did not take you for a man who hums," Elena teased gently, glancing over her shoulder. Colt looked up, a rare, genuine smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "My mother used to sing that when I was young," he admitted, "before everything fell apart." I had not thought of it in years until just now. Elena's chest ached at the quiet vulnerability in his admission, and she found herself crossing the room to sit beside him, drawn by an instinct she no longer bothered to question. "Tell me about her," she said softly. "Your mother." Colt hesitated only briefly before beginning to speak, painting a picture of a woman strong and gentle in equal measure, who had raised him to understand that true strength meant protecting those who could not protect themselves, a lesson he had carried with him even through years of running and hiding from a fate he had never chosen. Elena listened closely, cataloging every detail, understanding with each word that the man beside her was far more than the outlaw label the wanted poster had assigned him. As the days passed and the immediate threat of the scouts seemed to recede, at least for the moment, Elena and Colt allowed themselves brief pockets of peace amid the tension, evenings spent talking long after the fire had burned low, mornings spent working side by side with an ease that spoke of a partnership deepening far beyond simple necessity. Neither spoke aloud of the growing feelings tangled between them, though both recognized the shift happening regardless of whether words were spoken to confirm it. It was during one such quiet morning, as Elena hung laundry despite the biting cold, that Colt approached her with a seriousness that immediately set her on edge. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to listen without interrupting until I have finished." Elena set down the shirt in her hands, giving him her full attention. Colt drew a steadying breath before continuing. "Dale will not stop searching until he finds me," he said. "And when he does, staying here will no longer be safe for either of us. I have been thinking of leaving before that happens, alone, so that whatever danger follows me does not follow you as well." Elena's stomach dropped, a sharp, unexpected pain blooming in her chest at the thought of him simply walking away into the snow to face his enemies without her. "No," she said immediately, more firmly than she intended. "Elena," he began, but she cut him off with a shake of her head. "I did not save your life just to watch you throw it away, trying to protect me from a danger I have already chosen to face alongside you," she said. "If you leave with me, or you do not leave at all." Colt studied her for a long moment, something fierce and tender warring behind his eyes. "You are certain?" he asked quietly. "Once you step outside the safety of these walls, there will be no pretending this danger does not exist." "I have never been more certain of anything," Elena replied, and meant it entirely. Whatever answer Colt might have given in response was cut short by a sound neither of them expected. A distant howl followed swiftly by two more, closer and more urgent than any they had heard before. Colt's entire body went rigid, his eyes flashing gold as he turned toward the tree line with an intensity that left no room for doubt. "They are coming," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Now." Elena's heart pounded as she dropped the laundry entirely and ran toward the cabin, Colt close behind her, both of them understanding in that single frozen instant that the quiet winter they had built together, fragile and precious, had finally run out of time. Elena barred the door the moment they were both inside, her hands fumbling with the heavy iron latch as her heart pounded against her ribs. Colt moved through the cabin with swift, purposeful steps, pulling the curtains shut and checking each window with a focus that left no room for panic, though the tension radiating from him told her clearly enough how serious the threat had become. "How many?" Elena asked, pressing her back against the wall beside the window, careful to stay out of sight. "At least 3, Colt answered, "possibly more circling from the far side of the ridge. They will not attack the cabin directly if they believe there is any chance of drawing attention from the town below, but if they corner me outside these walls, they will not hold back." "Then you are not going outside," Elena said firmly. Colt turned to face her, his expression torn between gratitude and a deep, protective fear that had nothing to do with his own safety and everything to do with hers. "If they breach these walls," he said quietly, "I cannot promise I will be able to protect you as the man you have come to know. I may have to become something else entirely, and I need you to understand that before it happens, so that when you see it, you are not afraid of me." Elena held his gaze steadily, despite the fear coursing through her veins. "I am already choosing to stand beside you," she said. "Whatever shape that requires you to take, I trust the man beneath it." The howls grew louder outside, circling closer, and Colt's body tensed visibly, a low growl building deep in his throat that sounded nothing like the voice she had grown accustomed to over the past week. "Stay behind me," he said, moving toward the door as the first heavy weight slammed against it from the outside, the wood groaning under the impact. Elena grabbed the iron poker from beside the fireplace, positioning herself exactly where he had instructed, her entire body trembling, though she refused to let fear paralyze her completely. The door shuddered again under a second impact, splinters beginning to crack along the frame, and Colt's control finally broke entirely. She watched, breath caught somewhere between horror and awe, as his body began to shift, bones reshaping beneath skin that stretched and darkened, fur sprouting along limbs that lengthened and twisted into something powerful and entirely inhuman. Within seconds, the man she had nursed back to health, the man whose quiet stories and gentle humming had softened something guarded deep inside her own heart, had transformed into an enormous wolf, larger than any natural creature had a right to be, its fur a deep charcoal gray, its eyes still holding that same familiar gold she had come to recognize as unmistakably his own. The door finally splintered open, and 3 wolves surged into the cabin, smaller than Colt but still massive and dangerous, their teeth bared and their eyes wild with the singular purpose of their hunt. Colt met them without hesitation, his enormous form colliding with the lead wolf in a violent tangle of fur and snarling fury, driving it back through the broken doorway and into the snow beyond. Elena pressed herself against the wall, gripping the poker tightly as one of the remaining wolves turned its attention toward her, its lips curling back over sharp teeth as it advanced slowly, sensing an easier target than the alpha currently locked in battle outside. She raised the poker, her hands shaking but steady enough to swing with real force if the creature came within reach, refusing to let fear override the fierce determination burning in her chest. Before the wolf could close the distance, Colt reappeared in the doorway, blood matting his fur along one shoulder, and threw himself between Elena and the advancing threat with a ferocity that sent the smaller wolf scrambling backward in retreat. The battle outside continued for what felt like an eternity, though it likely lasted only minutes, snarls and impacts echoing through the snow-covered yard until, finally, silence fell. Colt returned to the doorway alone, his wolf form bloodied but upright, and slowly, painfully, shifted back into the man Elena had come to know, collapsing to his knees just inside the threshold as exhaustion overtook him entirely. Elena rushed to his side immediately, dropping the poker and gathering him against her without a single moment of hesitation or fear, her hands checking his wounds with the same careful precision she had used the very first night she found him in the snow. "You are safe," he murmured weakly, his voice barely audible. "They will not return tonight. But Dale will know now. He will know exactly where to find me. Then we prepare for what comes next," Elena said firmly, helping him toward the fire despite her own trembling limbs. Together. Colt looked up at her, something profound and unguarded shining behind his exhausted eyes, and in that fragile, blood-soaked moment, neither of them needed words to understand that whatever bond had grown quietly between them through the long days of the storm had solidified into something neither danger nor distance could easily break. They spent the remainder of that night tending to wounds and reinforcing what remained of the broken door, working in a silence that spoke louder than conversation ever could. By the time dawn broke, gray and cold over the mountains, both of them understood, without needing to discuss it, that remaining in the cabin was no longer an option. Dale now knew precisely where Colt had been hiding, and it was only a matter of time before he returned with far greater numbers than 3 scouts alone. Elena packed what supplies she could carry, her hands steady despite the ache of leaving behind the only home she had known since her husband's passing. Colt, still moving stiffly from the previous night's battle, insisted on carrying the heavier bundles himself, brushing aside her protests with a stubbornness that reminded her, not unkindly, of how much of himself he still kept carefully guarded even now. "Where will we go?" Elena asked as they stepped out into the cold morning light, the broken door standing open behind them like a wound the cabin itself would carry long after they had gone. "There is a settlement 2 days south, hidden in the hills, where others like me have found safety from packs that turned against them," Colt explained. "If we can reach it, we will have allies, and time enough to plan how to reclaim what Dale stole from me." Elena nodded, tightening the strap of her pack over her shoulder, and together they set off into the snow-covered wilderness, leaving behind the fragile peace of the storm-locked cabin for a journey neither of them could fully predict the outcome of. Behind them, faint and distant, a lone howl rose over the mountains, a warning carried on the wind that their pursuers had not given up the chase, and would not, until either Colt reclaimed his rightful place or both of them paid the ultimate price for daring to hope for something more than mere survival. The journey south tested both of them in ways neither had anticipated. The mountain paths, treacherous even in fair weather, had become nearly impassable under the weight of fresh snow, forcing them to move slowly and carefully, conserving their strength for the miles still ahead. Colt's injuries from the previous night's battle, though healing faster than any ordinary man's would, still slowed his pace enough that Elena found herself matching his rhythm rather than the other way around, a quiet reversal that neither of them commented on directly. They spoke little during the first day, both focused on the physical demands of the journey, but as evening approached and they found shelter beneath a rocky overhang, conversation slowly returned, carrying with it a depth that had not existed between them before the battle at the cabin. Elena found herself asking questions she had previously held back, curious now about the world Colt had hidden from her for so long. "Tell me about Dale," she said as they huddled close to a small, carefully hidden fire. "What kind of man betrays someone he was sworn to protect?" Colt's expression darkened, old anger flickering behind his eyes. "Dale was never satisfied with his position beneath me," he said. "He believed leadership belonged to whoever could seize it through strength and cunning alone, regardless of loyalty or honor. When our previous alpha, my own father, was killed, Dale ensured every piece of evidence pointed toward me, knowing the pack would be too grief-stricken and confused to question his account of events." "And no one believed you?" Elena asked gently. "Some did," Colt admitted. "Enough that I was given the chance to run, rather than face immediate judgment. But running only confirmed my guilt in the eyes of those who remained uncertain. And Dale has spent every day since consolidating his power, ensuring that if I ever return, I return to a pack too afraid of him to listen to reason." Elena absorbed this information carefully, understanding now the full weight of what Colt carried with him, not just the physical danger of pursuit, but the deeper wound of betrayal by someone he had once trusted completely. She reached across the small fire and took his hand, offering silent comfort in place of words that felt inadequate to the situation. "We will find a way to prove your innocence," she said firmly. "Whatever it takes." Colt squeezed her hand gently, gratitude and something warmer shining in his tired eyes. "I do not deserve someone as steadfast as you," he said quietly. "Yet I find myself grateful beyond words that fate placed you on that particular stretch of snow the night I nearly died." Elena felt her cheeks warm, despite the biting cold surrounding them. "Perhaps fate simply recognized we needed each other," she said softly. And the look Colt gave her in response, tender and searching, told her clearly enough that he felt the same growing certainty settling between them. They continued their journey the following morning, the physical distance between them shrinking with each passing hour, even as the miles behind them grew longer. By midday, they crested a ridge overlooking a narrow valley, and Colt paused, scanning the horizon with the same intense focus Elena had come to recognize as his particular gift. "We are being followed," he said quietly, his jaw tightening. "Not scouts this time." Trackers, sent specifically to find our trail and report back to Dale directly. Elena's stomach tightened with fresh fear. How far behind? She asked. Close enough that we cannot afford to slow our pace, Colt replied. We need to reach the settlement before nightfall, or risk facing far more than 3 wolves this time. They pressed forward with renewed urgency, the peaceful moments of the previous evening giving way once again to the sharp vigilance survival demanded. Elena kept pace despite her exhaustion, drawing strength from a determination that had only grown stronger since the battle at the cabin, refusing to let fear slow her steps or weaken her resolve. As the sun began its slow descent behind the western peaks, casting long shadows across the snow-covered valley, Colt suddenly stopped, his body going rigid with an alertness that immediately put Elena on edge. They have found our trail, he said grimly, turning to face the ridge behind them. We need to move, now. They ran, Elena's legs burning with the effort of pushing through deep snow while carrying the weight of her pack, Colt matching her pace despite his own lingering injuries. Behind them, the distant sound of pursuit grew steadily louder. Footsteps and low growls carried on the wind, closing the gap between them with alarming speed. We will not outrun them on foot much longer, Colt said between labored breaths. When I give the signal, I need you to keep running toward the valley floor and do not look back, no matter what you hear. I am not leaving you behind, Elena said fiercely, refusing even to consider the possibility. I am not asking you to leave me behind, Colt clarified. I am asking you to trust that I will catch up once I have slowed them down enough to buy us the time we need. Before Elena could argue further, 3 shapes broke over the ridge behind them, moving with terrifying speed across the snow, closing the distance far faster than she had anticipated. Colt shoved her forward gently but firmly, his body already beginning to shift as he turned to face the approaching threat. Run, he said, his voice already deepening into something less human, and Elena, though every instinct screamed against it, forced her legs to carry her forward, trusting him as she had trusted him from the very first night she found him bleeding in the snow. Behind her, the sounds of battle erupted once more, snarls and impacts echoing across the valley, and Elena pressed forward through the trees, her heart pounding with fear for Colt even as she fought to obey his instructions. The settlement, if Colt's directions had been accurate, lay just beyond the next rise, and she focused every remaining ounce of strength on reaching it. She burst through the tree line moments later, nearly colliding with a woman standing guard at the edge of a cluster of hidden cabins built cleverly into the surrounding hillside, disguised well enough that Elena would never have found them without Colt's guidance. The woman, tall and sharp-eyed, raised a hand immediately, signaling others nearby before addressing Elena directly. "Who are you, and why are you running?" the woman demanded, though her tone carried more caution than hostility. "I am with Colt," Elena gasped out, struggling to catch her breath. "He sent me ahead. He is fighting Dale's trackers just beyond the ridge." The woman's expression shifted instantly, sharp recognition flashing behind her eyes. "Colt Ashby," she said, more statement than question. Elena nodded, and the woman turned immediately, calling out orders to several others who had gathered nearby, their expressions shifting from wariness to urgent determination as they moved swiftly toward the tree line to offer assistance. Elena remained rooted in place, her entire body trembling with adrenaline and fear as she waited, every second stretching unbearably long for word of Colt's fate. Minutes passed like hours before figures finally emerged from the trees, and Elena's heart leapt with relief when she saw Colt among them, bruised and exhausted but alive, supported on either side by 2 of the settlement's residents. She rushed to him immediately, ignoring the curious and cautious glances of the gathered strangers, and wrapped her arms around him carefully, mindful of his injuries but unable to hold back the flood of relief crashing through her. "You are alive," she breathed against his shoulder. Colt returned the embrace weakly but firmly, his exhaustion evident in every line of his battered body. "I told you I would catch up," he murmured, a faint, tired smile touching his lips despite everything. The settlement's leader, a steady older woman named Ivy Marsh, who carried herself with quiet authority, welcomed them into the largest of the hidden cabins, where Colt's wounds were tended, and Elena finally allowed herself to rest after 2 days of relentless travel and fear. As night fell over the hidden valley, Ivy gathered a small group of trusted allies, and Colt, despite his exhaustion, began explaining the situation in careful detail, laying out everything Dale had done and everything that still needed to be done to reclaim his rightful place and clear his name once and for all. Elena listened closely from her place beside him, understanding now that the fight was far from over, that the battle at the cabin and the chase through the mountains had only been the beginning of a much larger confrontation still waiting on the horizon. But for the first time since she had found Colt bleeding in the snow, she felt something steady beneath the fear, a growing confidence that whatever came next, they would face it together, surrounded now by allies willing to stand beside them in the fight for justice, long overdue. Ivy Marsh listened carefully as Colt recounted every detail of Dale's betrayal, her weathered face giving little away until he finished speaking entirely. The cabin around them fell silent, the small gathering of settlement residents exchanging glances heavy with old memories and unresolved grievances of their own. "You are not the first to arrive at our door carrying a story like this one," Ivy said finally. "Dale Ferris has made enemies of more than just yourself, Colt Ashby. Several among us here fled his cruelty long before you were ever forced to run." Colt's expression sharpened with cautious hope. "Then you would be willing to help me expose the truth?" he asked. "Willing," Ivy confirmed, "though willingness alone will not be enough. Dale has spent years consolidating power within your former pack, ensuring loyalty through fear rather than respect. Simply returning and declaring your innocence will accomplish nothing if the pack elders remain too frightened of him to listen." "Then what would accomplish something?" Elena asked, speaking up for the first time since the discussion began. Ivy turned her sharp gaze toward Elena, studying her with open curiosity. "Proof," she said simply. "Undeniable evidence of Dale's crimes, presented before the full council of elders in a setting where he cannot silence dissent through intimidation alone. Fortunately, we may have exactly what is needed." She gestured toward a quiet man seated near the back of the gathering, introduced simply as Marcus, who had served as a healer within Colt's former pack years earlier, before fleeing Dale's growing cruelty himself. "Marcus was present the night your father died," Ivy explained. "He has never spoken publicly of what he witnessed, fearing retribution, but with the right support, his testimony combined with additional evidence we have gathered over the years might finally be enough to convince the elders of the truth." Colt turned to Marcus, with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "You saw what truly happened?" he asked quietly. Marcus nodded slowly, old sorrow etched deeply into his weathered features. "I saw enough to know you were innocent," he said. "I have carried the guilt of my silence for years, fearing what speaking the truth might cost me. But watching you fight so fiercely to survive, to protect this woman beside you, has reminded me that some silences cost far more than the risks required to break them." A plan began to take shape over the following days, careful and deliberate, designed to expose Dale's crimes before the full council in a setting where his usual methods of intimidation would hold little power. Elena found herself drawn increasingly into the planning itself, her sharp mind and steady resolve earning quiet respect from the settlement's residents, who had initially regarded her with understandable caution. As preparations continued, the bond between Elena and Colt deepened further, tested and strengthened by the shared purpose now driving them both forward. Late one evening, as the settlement settled into quiet rest, Colt found Elena standing alone beneath the clear winter sky, watching stars scatter brilliantly across the darkness above the hidden valley. "You have given up everything to help me," he said softly, coming to stand beside her. "Your home, your safety, the quiet life you built for yourself after loss. I cannot ask you to sacrifice anything further." Elena turned to face him, her expression steady and certain. "You did not ask me for any of it," she said. "I chose this, Every step of the way. Because somewhere between finding you bleeding in the snow and watching you fight to protect me against creatures twice your size, I realized that whatever life I return to after this, I want it to include you standing beside me in it. Colt's breath caught, something raw and vulnerable flickering across his features before he reached out, gently cupping her face in his hands. I have spent years running from everything and everyone, he admitted quietly. Never allowing myself to hope for something as steady and true as what has grown between us. But I find myself unwilling to run from this, from you, no matter what challenges still stand ahead. Elena leaned into his touch, her heart steady despite the uncertainty still surrounding their future. Then let us face whatever comes together, she said simply, and when Colt closed the remaining distance between them, sealing the moment with a tender, searching kiss beneath the winter stars, Elena understood with absolute clarity that whatever the outcome of the battle still ahead, she had already found something worth every risk she had taken to protect it. The following morning, word arrived that Dale had summoned the full council of elders for an urgent gathering, having learned of Colt's survival and his growing alliance with the hidden settlement. Whatever advantage secrecy had once provided them was now gone entirely, and the time had come to act swiftly, before Dale could consolidate further support or silence Marcus and the other witnesses gathered on Colt's behalf. Ivy Marsh gathered the small group of allies once more, her expression grave but resolute. "The council meets in 2 days' time," she said. "If we intend to present our evidence and expose the truth, we must be prepared to face Dale directly, on ground he believes belongs entirely to him." Colt nodded, determination hardening his features despite the danger clearly waiting ahead. "Then we prepare," he said, and beside him, Elena felt the fierce certainty settle firmly into place, knowing that whatever challenges the coming days held, she would face them standing exactly where she belonged, beside the man who had changed the entire course of her quiet, solitary life the night she found him wounded in the snow. The journey back toward Colt's former territory took the better part of 2 days, the small group moving carefully through mountain passes, still thick with winter snow, every mile bringing them closer to a confrontation none of them could fully predict the outcome of. Elena walked beside Colt for much of the journey, drawing strength from his steady presence, even as her own nerves tightened with each passing hour. Marcus traveled with them as well, along with 2 other former pack members who had agreed to testify alongside him, their courage bolstered by Colt's determination and the quiet reassurance Ivy Marsh provided throughout the journey. By the time they crested the final ridge overlooking the valley where Colt's former pack made its home, the sun had begun its slow descent toward the western peaks, casting long golden light across the snow-covered landscape below. "This is it," Colt said quietly, pausing to take in the sight of the territory he had once called home. "Whatever happens down there will determine everything that comes after. For me, for the pack, and for anyone who has ever suffered under Dale's rule." Elena reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his without hesitation. "Then let us go finish this," she said, and together, flanked by their small group of allies, they began the final descent toward the gathering place where the pack elders had convened at Dale's summons. Word of their arrival spread quickly through the territory, and by the time they reached the central gathering hall, a crowd had already formed, pack members murmuring among themselves at the unexpected sight of their exiled former alpha returning openly, accompanied by witnesses long thought silent and an outsider whose presence alone raised countless questions. Dale Ferris stood at the head of the gathering hall, flanked by loyal enforcers, his expression shifting rapidly from shock to carefully masked hostility as Colt entered with his allies close behind him. The elders, seated in a solemn row along the far wall, watched the unfolding scene with cautious, unreadable expressions. "You have some nerve returning here," Dale said coldly, his voice carrying easily across the hushed gathering hall. "Especially with an outsider in tow, and traitors who abandoned this pack years ago at your side. I have returned to reclaim what was stolen from me through lies and manipulation," Colt replied, his voice steady and commanding despite the tension radiating through the room. "And I have brought witnesses who will finally speak the truth. This pack has been denied for far too long." Dale's expression tightened, though he maintained his composure before the watching elders. "Lies from a coward who fled rather than face judgment for his father's murder," he said dismissively. "I would think carefully before trusting the word of exiles and outsiders over the alpha who has kept this pack safe and stable in his absence." Marcus stepped forward then, his voice trembling slightly but growing steadier with each word. "I was present the night our previous alpha died," he said, addressing the elders directly. "I saw Dale Ferris deliver the fatal wound himself, and I watched him plant evidence afterward to shift blame entirely onto Colt Ashby's shoulders. I remained silent out of fear for my own safety, a silence I deeply regret and can no longer justify maintaining." Gasps rippled through the gathered crowd, and Dale's carefully maintained composure finally cracked, fury flashing behind his eyes as he turned toward Marcus with barely contained rage. "Lies!" Dale spat, though the desperation in his voice undermined the certainty of his denial. "Fabrications designed to reinstate a criminal who should have faced execution rather than exile." The two additional witnesses stepped forward then, offering their own corroborating accounts of Dale's cruelty and manipulation over the years he had held power, painting a picture the elders could no longer dismiss as simple coincidence or conspiracy. As the testimonies accumulated, Elena watched the expressions of the watching pack members shift from confusion to growing anger directed not at Colt, but at the man who had ruled over them through fear and deception for far too long. The eldest among the council members, a stern woman with silver hair and piercing eyes, finally rose to address the gathering directly. "The evidence presented here today demands a formal challenge," she declared. "Dale Ferris, if you maintain your innocence, you may face Colt Ashby directly, in accordance with the old ways, and let the outcome determine the truth this pack deserves." Dale's eyes flashed with barely restrained panic, though he straightened his shoulders, clearly understanding that refusing the challenge before the entire gathered pack would confirm his guilt as surely as losing the confrontation itself. "Very well," he said, his voice tight with forced confidence. "Let us settle this the way it should have been settled from the very beginning." Elena's heart pounded as the crowd cleared space within the gathering hall, forming a wide circle around the two men who would soon face each other in a battle that carried far more weight than simple combat. Colt turned to her briefly before the challenge began, his expression calm despite the danger waiting ahead. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "know that meeting you was the truest gift this entire ordeal has given me." Elena squeezed his hand tightly, refusing to let fear overwhelm the fierce faith she held in him. "You will win this," she said firmly, "because unlike him, you have something worth fighting for beyond simple power." Colt's expression softened briefly before hardening once more into fierce determination as he stepped into the circle, shedding his outer garments as Dale did the same on the opposite side. The transformation began almost simultaneously, both men shifting into their wolf forms with a speed and intensity that spoke of years of pent-up rivalry finally reaching its inevitable conclusion. The battle that followed was fierce and unforgiving, both wolves circling and striking with calculated precision, the watching crowd falling utterly silent as they witnessed the culmination of years of hidden betrayal finally being answered through combat. Elena watched with her heart in her throat, every instinct screaming to look away even as she forced herself to remain steady, refusing to abandon Colt even in spirit during his moment of greatest trial. Dale fought with the desperate ferocity of a man who understood exactly what defeat would cost him, but Colt fought with something Dale had long since lost, a genuine, unwavering conviction rooted in truth rather than fear. Slowly, gradually, Colt's superior control and unwavering focus began to overwhelm Dale's increasingly wild and desperate attacks, until finally, with a decisive strike that echoed across the silent gathering hall, Colt pinned his former second-in-command beneath him, victory unmistakable to every witness present. The elders rose immediately, the eldest among them declaring the outcome with solemn finality. "The truth has been spoken, and the challenge has confirmed it," she announced. "Dale Ferris, you are stripped of all authority and standing within this pack, exiled effective immediately for crimes against your own alpha and the trust this pack placed in your leadership." Dale, defeated and humiliated before the entire gathered pack, offered no further resistance as he was escorted away. His reign of manipulation finally and permanently ended. Colt shifted back into his human form slowly, exhaustion evident in every line of his body, but relief and vindication shining unmistakably behind his eyes as the pack, freed finally from years of fear and deception, began to gather around him with expressions of respect and welcome long denied. Elena rushed forward the moment the crowd allowed, wrapping her arms around Colt without hesitation, uncaring of the watching eyes surrounding them both. "You did it," she whispered against his shoulder, relief and pride flooding through her in equal measure. "We did it," Colt corrected gently, pulling back just enough to meet her eyes with a warmth that promised everything neither of them had dared speak aloud until this very moment. "None of this would have been possible without you, Elena. Your courage, your steadfast faith, carried me through every single step of this journey." The eldest council member approached them then, her expression softened considerably from the solemn authority she had carried throughout the confrontation. "The pack formally welcomes you back as our rightful alpha, Colt Ashby," she said, "and extends its gratitude to the woman who sheltered you through the storm that nearly claimed your life, and who stood beside you through every trial that followed." In the weeks that followed, Colt worked carefully to rebuild the trust and stability Dale's cruel leadership had eroded, guided by the same steady conviction that had carried him through exile, betrayal, and battle alike. Elena remained by his side throughout the entire process, gradually earning the genuine respect and warmth of a pack that had initially regarded her with understandable caution, until finally she was welcomed not simply as an outsider who had helped restore their rightful leader, but as someone belonging fully within their community. On a clear evening many weeks later, as the last stubborn traces of winter finally began melting into the promise of spring, Colt led Elena to a quiet overlook above the territory he had reclaimed, the same valley where his father had once led before him, and where he now intended to build a future far different from the fear and manipulation that had nearly destroyed everything his family had built. "I once told you that meeting you was the truest gift this ordeal gave me," he said softly, turning to face her fully beneath the darkening sky. "I find myself wanting to give you something in return, something that speaks to exactly how much you have come to mean to me since that first terrible night in the storm." Elena's breath caught as Colt knelt before her, producing a simple, elegant ring crafted from silver, its design echoing the same protective strength she had come to associate with everything he stood for. "Elena Whitfield," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "You found me broken and dying in the snow, and rather than turning away, you chose to fight alongside me through every danger that followed. I am asking you now to continue choosing that path beside me, not out of necessity or danger, but out of the genuine, steady love that has grown between us. Will you stay, not simply as my mate in the eyes of my pack, but as my equal partner in everything the future holds for us both?" Tears gathered in Elena's eyes as she knelt before him, cupping his face gently in her hands. "From the moment I dragged you through that storm," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "some part of me understood that my quiet, solitary life had changed forever. I would not trade a single moment of the danger and uncertainty that followed, because it led me exactly here, to you. Yes, Colt Ashby. I will stay, beside you, for whatever the future holds." As Colt gently slid the ring onto her finger, the pack gathered below in the valley let out a rising chorus of joyful howls, carried up toward the overlook on the gentle evening breeze, celebrating not simply the return of their rightful alpha, but the beginning of a new chapter built on truth, loyalty, and a love strong enough to survive the harshest winter either of them had ever faced. Standing together beneath the darkening sky, surrounded by the promise of a future finally free from fear, Elena understood with absolute certainty that the storm which had once threatened to end everything had instead given her something she had never dared hope to find again after losing so much: a home, a purpose, and a love steady and true enough to weather any storm that might yet come their way.